Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to BioStrategy Partners Practical Knowledge Series September panel presentation. Today's topic is data integrity and reproducibility, keys to successful technology transfer. First, a little bit about BioStrategy Partners. We are a not-for-profit organization, and our ambition is to advance and speed the development of technologies spinning out of our academic centers in the region to accelerate their commercialization efforts. And we do that through two key programs. One is our Germinator program, and we're pleased to be having launched just this past week or so a new Germinator program with our friends at Fuji-Rabio Diagnostics, and we have a representative of Fuji-Rabio here joining us on the panel today. And we also have a program called the Practical Knowledge Series, of course, and this is where we try and communicate via the voices of the experts in the region tips for accelerating technology transfer, growing businesses, how to do things to bring your technologies to fruition, to the marketplace, to patients and clinicians as smoothly and quickly as possible. We have a great panel for you today. I will be your moderator, but that's not what makes it great. What makes it great is our fantastic panelists. We have Rianne Esquivel from Fuji-Rabio. I will allow folks to introduce themselves in more detail in just a few moments here, but just to lay the land here. We have Ru Chao, and he is going to join us from the University of Sciences. And then we have Indrajit Sen-Ranth, and forgive me for stumbling over that last name there. He is a fellow with Keiretsu Forum, and he is also an associate professor of physics at Lock Haven University. And I'd like to point out that one of the great things about this particular panel is that we have individuals who represent all three important points along the continuum to commercialization. We have folks who represent the academic environment. We have someone who represents the industry environment, and then we have sort of, I'll say, sitting in the middle of those two, the investor perspective as well. So we have these three different perspectives being represented by our panelists today. So this should be a very insightful conversation that we're about to have. I'd like to take just another moment to introduce and to you our sponsors. We definitely appreciate the effort and the funding that these sponsors provide. They do make it possible for folks like those of you in our audience to participate in and get this knowledge at no cost to you. It comes to us from MVM Associates, Césaire Revise Intellectual Property Attorneys, and University Place Associates. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our panelists to just briefly introduce themselves. You're going to hear a lot about their work because part of what we're going to do today is encourage them to draw on their particular perspectives and their particular expertise. But let's start with just some quick introductions. And how about if we begin with Rianne?
Sure, thank you. So it's nice to meet all of you. My name is Rianne Esquivel. As we mentioned, I'm the Scientific Affairs Manager at Fuji-Rabio Diagnostics. I started with a PhD in microbiology from the University of Pennsylvania. I did a postdoctoral fellowship in vaccine research at the Wistar Institute with Dr. David Weiner. And then for the last 2 years, I've been at Fuji-Rabio. And in scientific affairs, we touch a lot of the areas that are really important with data reproducibility and integrity. So I was really excited to be a part of this panel.
Thank you. And how about if we move on to Indrajit?
Hi, everybody. And Michelle, thank you for having me. I got my PhD from Louisiana State University in solid state physics and surfaces. And my research also kind of go with that, but focus more on sensors and nanotechnology. And I've gotten I got my MBA from Westchester University. And then I got involved with the Keiretsu Forum, one of the premier consortiums of angel, VC, and private equity investors. I am very happy to be here, and hopefully I can contribute in terms of the data integrity, reproducibility, as well as why it's very important in this process of startups.
Excellent, thank you. And last but not least, Ru, please.
Yes, my name is Ru Chao. My PhD is from Manchester University, UK. and I came into this country because of cancer research that I was doing. After my PhD, I did a postdoc at the Chester Beatty Research Institute, which is the Royal Cancer Institute. Here in the United States, I've just always been in the Philadelphia area. Currently, I am a professor at the University of Sciences. The area that I'm teaching is both the pharmacy students, because the University of Sciences used to be called the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy and Science. I teach pharmacy students, and as well as in a bachelor's and graduate program of pharmacology toxicology in the department that I'm in, which is the pharmaceutical sciences. My research area, as I mentioned, is in cancer, particularly in relation to cancer interaction with each other and cell motility, as well as invasion and cell interaction with substratum. Recently, I developed XMOS because of Ivan Oransky and Adam Marcus had a blog site called Watch. So I used their information from retracted literature to teach students about the data integrity, how to evaluate literature, and also reproducibility issues. So I hope that I can contribute from the point of view of the academician in this discussion. And thank you, Michelle, for the invitation.
Wonderful. It's again my pleasure to have all three of you here today. A bit about logistics before we really get into the conversation in earnest. This panel is being recorded, so we encourage you to please mute both your video of yourself and your phones. We do, however, encourage questions, and please go ahead and submit those via chat at any time. My colleague Erica Swift, who is president of BioStrategy Partners, is also on the call with us today, and she will be monitoring the chat room. So please send your question to everyone. Erica will pick that up, and we will address those either as the conversation moves along or at the end. So thank you, everyone. I thought it might be a good place to start the conversation today, since we have these three very distinct perspectives that certainly complement one another, that we begin with if you could please give us some sense of why this topic of data integrity and reproducibility is important from your perspective. And I think maybe we could start with Rianne there, if you don't mind, please.
I don't. So Fuji Rebio Diagnostics is a global company. We manufacture in vitro diagnostics for cancer, infectious disease, and neurological issues. And we also work with academic partners to in-license antibodies that we can manufacture at Fuji Rebio as well. So we work in a couple of different areas, but obviously when we in-license antibodies from our academic partners, data reproducibility becomes a huge factor and of importance. We really need to ensure that those antibodies that we are interested in obtaining are really the antibody that the partner says they are, that they bind to, and that we can use them for their intended purposes. In addition, we can help other companies and academics take their antibody and develop it into an in vitro diagnostic that's FDA cleared. So we go to the FDA and we supply them with all of the data package that they would need to that product. And so in that sense, it's once again super important that you have data that has integrity, that's reproducible, because these are products that are going to be used in patients. So it's critical for
yeah,
patients.
thank you.
So
Kindly mute yourself if you're not among the panelists. Kindly mute your microphones.
So I think those are the two biggest areas where we
Okay, I will do. Thanks, Desi. And let us know if you need anything else. Okay, bye. Have a great weekend.
So So I think those are the two biggest areas where we really depend on data integrity and reproducibility from the industry side.
Excellent, thank you. Rui, perhaps you'd like to go next?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Rihanna, and thank you, Michelle. It's a very important issue. The reason is that, as you probably people know, that most of the basic research, or what is called the preclinical research, which Rihanna mentioned, are mostly done in academic institutions, universities, and research institutes, and so on. And this issue has really been brought to light in the last decade by two area of investigation. One is the number of retracted literature has increased immensely in the last decade. Now, of course, it's a very small proportion of all the papers that are published. Nevertheless, these are the retracted papers are ones that are very important. But why are they retracted? Well, one, because people tried to reproduce their data and it couldn't. And so it looks as if the data had contains some faultiness in it. Whether these are by error or by design is a different question. Another question.
Yes, this is me too.
Sorry?
Hello? Yes.
Hello?
Nitu, kindly mute your microphone, please.
Okay.
Oh, hi, Lenora. Thanks so much for calling. No, I didn't get a call yesterday, but yeah, we'll pick it up. Thanks so much.
Okay. All right. Let me continue
thank
then.
you. You too. Bye.
The second.
Our knife is at Williams Sonoma.
The second issue which was brought out was actually from a paper that's published, I think, 2015 in PLOS Biology by Friedman et al. Leonard Friedman et al. What he did is to analyze the cost of doing the basic research and the reproducibility of that. Well, it turns out that if you take a very conservative assessment, maybe half of it is reproducible, the other half is not. Of course, that's very conservative, because in the literature, it's been shown that in the field of cancer, some 80 or 90% of the studies carried out in academia are not reproducible. Now, the reproducibility has got many reasons behind it. So what Friedman pointed out was that if you just take a very conservative estimate of 50% being not reproducible, what would be the cost of that? And I think in 2015, what he did was to get a figure of somewhere around about $28 billion that are cost for the irreproducibility. So that's really quite a high amount of money that's involved in devoted to research that's not reproducible. And he further analyzed that the major reason for the irreproducibility, some 36% of that is due to the reagents and biological references and so on. So, for example, the cell line that's being used, it's been not well stated or not well characterized, and so on. And the other different areas are, so for example, the poor study design or the data analysis. Now, data analysis will account for something like a quarter of those irreproducible results. Now, that is, of course, related to one's understanding of the use of p-value. And unfortunately, that is an area in academia that people wanted to use p-value, but really not quite understanding the true meaning of the p-value. Because
Sorry,
p-value.
excuse me, Rui, I'm not sure everyone in our audience will understand what the p-value is. Would you mind spending just a moment saying what that is, please?
Yes, of course. It is a statistical analysis for the significance of the data, and then you use a value that has a probability of its of disproving your null hypothesis. So you have two sets of data that you wanted to see the numbers, how whether this is occurring by random or whether this is occurring by design of what the meaningfulness. But just having the evaluation of a p-value does not prove your hypothesis that you started off with. And so most people really jump to that, say, well, if I have a good p-value, meaning that my observation, my experimental data are rigid, are very reliable, it's not random, therefore therefore it proves my hypothesis. Now that doesn't really mean this case, because there are alternative hypotheses to be considered in this setting. So this is one of it's involved in data analysis. Of course, the other area of data analysis will be, say, images. People will use gel electrophoresis and then using the images to get the quantifiable data. Unfortunately, since the onset of Photoshop, which I think is the early 2000s, it allows scientists to do the manipulation very easily. So if you wanted to hide some things, or if you wanted to erase something to make it more beautiful, or to put some other two sets of work together and to present it in such a way that it is much more believable for the audience. But this is really not a very good practice, and these are all the issues which leads into the integrity of your data. And in academia, I'm sorry, should I continue talking, or should I?
You're fine. Yeah, why don't you finish this thought, and then we'll turn it over to
Okay.
Indrajit in a moment.
So the one of the reasons for this kind of things happening is that scientists are still sort of human, so they wanted to be very successful, just like people in business or in any other field. So in academia, there is such a pressure on publication and for applications to get funding, and funding can be mostly from the from government, NIH, and so on, NSF, or cancer institutes, American Cancer Society. In order to get that, get the funding, you need to have publication. In order to advance your career in academia, there is a thing that is called up and out, or publish or perish. That means that after a certain number of years, usually it's about 6 years in an academic institution, you have to show that you are up to it. And what is a measure is in fact publication. So unfortunately, teaching is a very important part, but that doesn't count as much as what one's scholarship is for many of the institutions. And therefore, people do shortcuts. It's just like I have mentioned earlier, and that they manipulate some of the data and so on. Therefore, the integrity is compromised. The data integrity is compromised. I think I'll stop here. Then there are many things that I can give a talk. This is one of the disadvantages of academic person, of a professor, is that professor never stops speaking and never stop. They just like to hear themselves, I think.
Well, we're very glad to be hearing from you today, but we will maybe turn it over to Indrajit for a moment to give his investor perspective, and maybe also his experience as an educator, academician, and scientist, physicist as well.
I think since Rui kind of touched base on academic side, in a way that I think it's very thorough, I'm going to focus more on the investor perspective in a startup who's seeking funding. In that case, there's two issues that I see. One is, of course, the reproducibility and the real interconnect with what's been asked and what's been given. And the other thing is the integrity aspect. Just to touch base, and we can kind of go on with this discussion and we can elaborate. But I think in the case of investors and then the group of people like me, in terms of evaluating prospective startups' approach to asking funding, there's two sides to this in terms of who's asking and who's giving. So in that sense, the data being reproducible as well as given in a way that is acceptable to the investors, it's really, really important if you want to get funded. And then the other part is, of course, the integrity part. Integrity comes into play with whether that data has a kind of like a path in terms of lock and key, and this key individuals who handles the data, especially in terms of value proposition. In other words, what kind of technology or unique recipe that is valuable for your company as a startup. So that needs to be protected, and that needs to have a chain of custody in terms of making sure that the integrity is not compromised. And I've seen number of times that these factors, which are very important, would work unfortunately against a company or companies, uh, although their science is really good in a way. In the sense I'm saying is that when you look at the data integrity issues, and then not being asked the disconnect, apart from that, their foundation is sound. This is what I want to say. So we can kind of elaborate as we go.
Michelle, can we interject as we as you said earlier, this was a discussion, right? A panel for discussion.
Absolutely.
For some reason, I think our screens are frozen right now. For certainly in my case, but I don't want to lose the trend of what Indulgence has said is really very, very important, is that like who will own the data or the intellectual properties, right? And I think that goes into the important aspect is how do you protect that? And I think the protection is to have a patent in the patent office. Now this is where I see there is a little bit of a disconnect because it's the patent office is assumes that the work that's presented to them for patent it has a strong integrity, and they don't check for reproducibility because patents have an issue when they issue a patent that there should be novel, there should be no previous work that's so reproducibility is not one of their the point that they should look for. And so how do you address that, Indulgence, that if you have a patent, if on the basic work a patent was issued and you assume that the data have good integrity, but then the reproducibility issue is not there until somebody comes to check on that. Now, from an academician's point of view, we don't really have the ability to do a lot of repeating other people's work to check on the reproducibility, because, as I said, you want to publish your work, and if you publish work that is reproducing other people's work, even though it may be very important, it's hard to get it published. People will say, well, there's no novelty in this, just to say this is to reproduce other people's work, although it may be important, but publishers don't want to accept papers that are just producing other people's work.
Maybe interject, or I'm sorry, please go ahead, please.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things that I've seen is like in terms of integrity, chain of custody is very important related to what you are mentioning, Roy. I've seen a lot of doubt come into investors' mind, especially going through due diligence, looking at asking from a startup to get the funding approval. So when we sit and go over this, one of the things that I've seen incidentally is that there was an incident once that the over the years collected data got compromised by a human resource personnel in a way that between a leadership split. So I would say that in terms of when you're looking at these scenarios where what we see is that, okay, your data that is extremely valuable in terms of getting an IP, and then making sure that these recipes or in terms of that, whatever you cannot make it to a patent, but these are things that you want to make sure that nobody gets their hands on. Getting compromised in a way that a person who's not supposed to handle this data, getting access to this data, that raises a lot of red flags, because that basically says that there are other issues in terms of management as well. So that is a negative way we look at the company, because that changes the perspective of the group of investors who sit in a panel like this. And in this particular case, there were a lot of other issues related to that. But I would say that that moment itself raised a big red flag. So what you want to be careful is, like, whenever you are kind of handling things, especially sensitive things, that you may already have a patent, but the other data that is probably ancillary to whatever that you have been doing, if you feel there is a reasonable value to that data, you want to make sure that there's a chain of custody to this. Because if you don't, you have a very high probability to get things compromised, and that's going to reflect badly on your future funding plans or future exit potential. So for example, when we sit and look at the data, we just don't look at your current position, right? We look at future exits. So in other words, there's a merger down the road, maybe 2 years down the road or 3 years down the road, or an acquisition by a bigger partner. So they will evaluate this data. There's no question about it, because they will look at this in a perspective of a merger, maybe about $50 million, $100 million worth. So before they dish out that money, they're going to sit down and go over all of that. So if we can see a compromise, some sort of a data compromise in terms of this sort of sensitive issues, that would work against you. So in that particular sense, I would say that the patent issue is a vast area, so I don't want to kind of jump over there, but I would say that these we forget as academicians, me being included, because we keep open books, we record data, and if you really want to build a company, you need to have a long-term and a strategic view about these things. And in terms of sensitive data, especially the things that you think it's going to be valuable, you have to be particularly careful about that. So I think that that's something that I had to kind of learn as well when I kind of started doing this. So I think that's something, a lot of startups are starting from, academic institutions, has some leadership coming from, academic personnel like professors or the faculty or some other involved individuals. Has to be very careful, very mindful about it.
You
Well,
are
thank you for
absolutely
that.
right.
And thank you for that. I'll add that we do have several panels recorded in our library, our PKS library on intellectual property protection. For those of you who might want to delve into that topic a little bit more deeply, we invite you to go and take a look at those. I'd like to maybe ask
Michelle,
Brianne.
we actually have a question. So this is for Indrajit. Sorry if I butchered your name.
Yeah, that's
so
fine.
the question is, have you seen any best practices for maintaining the chain of custody of the data when you're evaluating any of these companies?
I would think that there's no a recipe that you need to follow. One of the things that I would say is that if you're handling sensitive data that could have a market potential, I would make sure that you know who's handling data, especially once you are in the process of incorporating your company, right at the very beginning. Make sure that that data, that particular set of data, is handled by known responsible individuals, and that is separate from data that is not sensitive, because there's lots of other data as well. And then that process is continued throughout the progress of the company, because I think that those very beginnings are the points where you can have issues where things can get compromised, because you get serious as you move up the ladder. But at the very beginning, you are like in a place that is very fluidic, and there's so many things going on, and those are the points that you can be very vulnerable. So this is where I would be careful, even when you kind of move from a first 2 years as being incorporated. I would be very careful about, say for example, if you have a laptop, who has the access to that laptop? Are you going to store company emails in that laptop with the data? Who's going to have access to that laptop? So are you going to have a regular HR person who have access to that? These are very important things you need to consider, I think. And unfortunately, otherwise you're going to pay a high price down the road. So.
And I'd love to comment on this a little bit further from our industry perspective, in terms of going from academic to startup to and developing a product that you would want to gear towards a manufacturer or a company taking over in the end. It's really important to start at the beginning when you're developing this scientific product, that you actually talk to the people that are going to use it. Because in terms of data reproducibility, one of the biggest issues that we run into is when we talk to academic institutions, they have great data and it's all very interesting data in terms of an academic perspective. They're answering the question that they were very excited about. But when you think about it from the patient perspective and what they need and how this data needs to be reproduced to be able to be effective in the patient, sometimes those questions are left unanswered. We had a really unfortunate experience where we were looking at a really well-characterized tissue biomarker, and this lab wanted to develop it as a serobiomarker, which is great because those are what we do. They're straightforward. You take a blood sample, you move on. But in the end, it turned out this biomarker wasn't actually recognizing the native form of the protein in the patient. So that wastes years of research on this serobiomarker for them. So in that sense, it's just super critical to figure out the questions in the market area on your product very early.
Well, thank you, Rihanna. I certainly would like to hear this much more detailed one that you are personally experiencing. I wonder if I may just add on another one that we have, not myself experienced, but looking at the teaching point of view, using the retracted literature. There was a few years ago, there was a case of a professor who developed a prostate cancer marker. And a very innovative and very logical approach and so on. And he patented it, and then the patent was bought by a company, and the company then went to, as Inderjit said, doing diligence on this, and try to reproduce this. Well, it turns out that the effectiveness was just like tossing a coin. And so the company actually was very furious about this, because they spent a lot of money in supporting this research, and then the research turned out not to be real. Well, it turns out it's a very complicated story. It turns out that the institution, which is Johns Hopkins, had to return the millions of dollars to the company, because the company said that you actually had a product that is not what you actually stated. Now, what was interesting about this particular case that I mentioned, the prostate cancer marker, was that when they investigated this, it was found that it was due to fraudulent data. So in fact, it was not that the data had been compromised in the process of transferring, well, to, as that's possible. Indulgence has said in the computer, somebody went into it, or maybe it was not very well protected. But in fact, the initial investigating academician had fabricated the data in order to have a financial gain, I think. And one of the problems that I see was that this sort of thing happens, of course, hopefully not very often, but the academic institutions, usually universities, don't really do very much about this. And NIH also, because a lot of the work could be funded by NIH, NIH also does very little bit because they have no resources to look into the integrity of the data. They rely upon whistleblowers, they rely upon technicians telling them, and of the very, very egregious cases, which actually which often has happened. So when you look at the true number of how many were caught, so to speak, of people who fabricate data, that's very few. But in fact, it probably occurs much more frequently, and that, of course, is very difficult for getting into this step in industry for and the applicability and for patient treatment, such as drug development and so on. So that's one issue which is very difficult in I don't know how it can be addressed in academia, except of course the education aspect. This is why I think even at very early stage of educating students, this kind of strong integrity for reviewing data and for doing research instilled into students, the earlier the better.
I have a question. Rui mentioned early on what seemed to me some very startling percentages with respect to the data that can't be reproduced or that seems to have been
Yes.
compromised. I'm just wondering, Rian or Indrajit, do you see numbers? Does your experience reflect those kinds of high numbers in terms of ability to reproduce the data?
Jan, do you want to start? I can join later.
Sure. I couldn't say what percentage of the projects that we see are not reproducible, in the sense that they don't reproduce what the academic lab says they're going to reproduce, but oftentimes they just can't get to that next step. I would say about of being a commercial product, but I would say that, oftentimes maybe 40 to 50% of the time, it isn't doing exactly what they think it's doing either. So data reproducibility is a huge problem for us.
Interesting.
Yes, there's a. Sorry.
Go ahead, Ray.
If I'm saying this, there's a study that's done by Begley and Ellis. Dan, I think it's Dan Begley, or I can't remember his first name. He's in Australia. He actually, at that time, was working with the Amgen. And then what he did was that he wanted to figure out how many of the very exciting early findings, that's preclinical findings in terms of drug development for cancer, are reproducible. So Amgen supported this idea, and he took a large number of the studies that's published and tried to reproduce this. And then he only got 89% of non-reproducibility. I mean, that's very high. So he went back to the universities. These are from large universities, not trivial sort of researchers. And he said,
Ray?
I'm sorry, you dropped out there for a moment. Could you repeat the last part of your statement there, Rui? Do we still have Rian and Indrajit?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, very good. Rui, if you can hear us, may I recommend that you perhaps try to log out and log back in? It seems we might have lost your connection there. What I'd like to do is, please go ahead. I was going to ask. What I was going to ask both of you, Indrajit and Rian, to maybe comment on this notion that investors need and like to see the information and presented in a format that is useful or palatable to them. And sort of related question, we can maybe then go to you, Rian, and to talk about what an academic institution or an academician or researcher might expect when they start to engage with you. So I think the question also boils down to how is it that our academic audience can learn more about what you as investors and you as industry partners might need? And we'll start with Indrajit with that one.
So I want to take one step back and just reemphasize what I've said earlier before I kind of lose the thought process. I think that when I say make sure that chain of custody is established and be careful about it, I would say don't make it an overburden in terms of administrative process, but just be mindful about these things. That's important, and then you will start coming up with strategies by your own. So in the case of data that is asked by the investors and uh, the company is trying to provide, the reason is sometimes I think the startups, they are particularly the startups that I've worked with is device companies. I think in terms of device approval process through the FDA, you have 510K and PMA, and then of course de novo. So most of the devices go through what we call 510K. So in other words, you have a predicate device, and then you compare your device to the predicate device and go through that funnel of process. So I would say that one of the things that you automatically feel is that your clinical data is not really, required for this process. So I think that and also your sphere or your scope of market that you're focusing on. So that kind of gives you an idea. Okay, I only need this particular data, and I'm going to be okay. But the issue is that in the case of investors, they are looking at a much bigger picture. So I would say that in the phase of investors, they are looking at a lot of data, and in terms of data, they're looking at the data that in the eyes of a subsequent funding round, they would be happy and accept it, so that they would kind of buy in or do a merger with your company. So that's how the value gets created right now for the investors who are investing right now. In other words, say Series A set of funding. So subsequent Series C coming down after 3 years. But that you are looking at that point too, because otherwise the investors putting money right now, they can't get it out, right? So sometimes the startup founders gets frustrated in this process because they say, okay, this is the only thing you need, we are all good. But the investors on the other side might not see it that way, because they're looking at a much grander picture. They're not looking at 1 year down the road, but they're looking at 5 years down the road. And I think in the sense that you're submitting data, you want to kind of do a back and forth process. So in other words, if you're thinking of going on a startup route, your data should be, of course, good quality. And that is kind of something, unfortunately, won't get really kind of examined in the due diligence process, because there's no way to set up a lab and reevaluate data, unlike Rian, I think. So because of that, we cannot take it as such. You should have like 10 publications verifying your data, that we take it as such. But of those 10, what we need may be 5. That is very critical to the way we look at it. So it's your burden to provide that data so that the funding gets approved, you see. So I think that in the sense that this is a back and forth process, and it's very important to keep the channels open. So that way, your process is going to be win-win. So it's going to be a win to you, win to your investors. And down the road, most of the time, I would say 99% of the time, there will be a very good chance of being acquired, higher valuation. And the other thing is like, you are going to be in a place that is much better off in the grand scheme of things. So, so you have to be careful about keeping the communication channels open. How can I make sure that I understand you and you understand me? So we kind of most of the time we understand the founders, but the issue is that when you think you know a lot, and I'm not saying it's in a bad way, because I know I'm an academician in a way, and half of my life and the other half is this, but you have to be humble a little bit because you can't see everything. So just be mindful about that. That's important in this process, I think. Rian, if you...
I completely agree. I think if you know, an area that we see lacking a lot is trying to come to us with a project is an understanding of FDA requirements in the U.S. So if you know you have a biomarker that you want to be able to use in patients in the U.S., not truly understanding how a biomarker is going to be used in a hospital setting, or wanting to use it for a screening purpose, which is very complicated in the US, versus if you instead are thinking on a global perspective, maybe you know you have a disease that's endemic in China. In that sense, then your biomarker strategy is going to be very different, and you want to have the kind of studies that would support it for a global strategy. So I think that's probably what's lacking in a lot of the academic proposals we see, is just a clear path forward for how the biomarker will actually be used.
Excellent, that's helpful. So maybe, I'm sorry, Rui, please.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think one of the things that I alluded to is that there's no way that I think in industry people can figure out how strong the data represent until you start testing them yourself. So it's really a lot of effort and a lot of money that's going to be expended. And this is my point: is that in academia, the important thing is really how to educate students, or that by students I mean not just the undergraduates, but the graduate students, and how they actually go through the process of learning to with research and reproducibility to be able to publish and so on. All this process really starts there, and so that the results that are coming out will be credible. So I think this is one of the responsibility of people in academia, is to be able to be very honestly educate students, and then but unfortunately we can't control everybody in this way. There are ones who really wanted to move ahead, and they wanted to get their to be more famous, to get more grants, and to move up in their career much more, and so on. So this is human nature. So I don't know whether there is a solution. And this is really what I mentioned earlier on, was that, and I think Inderjit also pointed to this, is that the due diligence point, just by accepting what is the, let's say some work was granted a patent and so on, doesn't necessarily mean that is truthful data. One has to do a lot of putting a lot of effort, a lot of work, and so that's a lot of burden on the part of the industry to expend money and to check on the validity of the data. Reproducibility issue. There are probably ways that we can that are being improved. One of course, when I mentioned is that if journals are able to accept reproducing data rather than just say we need novel data. Journals. The point of view of a journal is that what they wanted to get audience and so on to read. And so they said, well, if you reproduce somebody's data, that would be also acceptable. And that is, it is sort of down the horizon that might be. But again, it's the cost of that. So who is going to spend money to reproduce data, somebody else's data? Let's say you have a good biomarker that this scientist really has a very well-known and had many hundreds of papers, not quite hundreds, maybe many papers supporting that work. How do you know that this is really very strong data? It's only until somebody else try to reproduce data, try to repeat the data, and then you say, well, yes, then I can believe that this is true. At the present, it's the industry who has to do that, and that I think is very costly.
Can I add something to that? Just going to take a minute. I think the data is extremely important in the startup process in a way that if you can establish your data is good and to the point relevant to your central thesis, in other words, the value proposition, it can actually help you to get more funding. Because in some cases, if you can convince the due diligence team that your vision is really valuable and you have good data to back up the journey so far, and if you feel like your proposal may not have enough money to go to the next step, do next clinical trials, they will be happy to provide that, because we have done that. We have actually increased the funding from what you have been asking, because in the end of the day, they want you to succeed. So your data is, in that sense, also very critical. So you need to look at it in a way that this is a journey, and then the way you are dealing with data is like, that's the proof that you're going to provide to whoever's going to, buy into your dream. So that's extremely important in convincing your party, especially in a startup process. So that it's like in God we trust, everything else we require data. Is 100% true in this case. 100% true.
So at this point, we're coming to the close of our hour, but it seems that Erica has received a question from the audience. I'll invite her to share that with us.
Sure. Thanks, Michelle. So yes, we received a question regarding CROs. Is there any role for them as far as evaluating data integrity, reproducibility? Does that make the technology more attractive to investors or industry partners?
So my comment on that would be, it's always nice to have more data, and if you go through a CRO, that's fine. But we're always going to have to replicate that data in our own hands as well. So, is it nice to see? Definitely, but it's not necessary.
Thank you. Any other questions, Erica?
Nope, that was the only other one.
Okay. Well, with that then, since again we're nearing the end of our hour, I'd love to maybe go around the table. Perhaps we'll start with Indrajit, and then to Rui, and then to Rian, and we'll ask just maybe one bit of closing advice here, a sentence or two, or perhaps three that you can share with our audience here, the things that you think are maybe the most important takeaway that you'd like them to remember from today, or maybe something you haven't had an opportunity to share with us just yet. How's that?
Do you want me to start, Michelle?
Please.
Okay. So I would say there's a couple of things I critically see. That is, of course, what I said in terms of chain of custody, in terms of data, particularly what's relevant to your value proposition, your central theme of your startup. And then the other thing is have clinical data, meaningful, repeatable, reproducible data that is well documented. If you can publish the data, related to your product, please have them ready. And that also, the important other thing is that whenever you seek funding, work with the team so that they get convinced in your process and they get buy into your process. And in the long term, understand that you're basically expanding your team, because most of the time in the Series A and also angel investing, you get a set of experts to work with you. So it's not like they are just giving you funding. So this is a journey they are willing to buy in, and I've seen the team members being board of directors in the process. So this is important, and basically your future lies on it. So that's my parting words.
Thank you.
Me or
Yes, please.
Rihanna? Okay.
Go ahead, Brew, please.
Yes, I think there's, without question, in academia, the reproducibility data is a very big issue and has to be very diligently sort of adhered to. And I think my perspective is that really it starts very early on in the educational process, and that's really how we can improve that. And I think in the academic field, people recognize that there is a very big problem in data reproducibility, because these are the early raw data that would be before it's handed to development and to be to the applied side. So my take-home message is that whenever young people in the education to become a scientist, they have to search out places where they do receive the proper training and so on. So that would be my message for in the future, when the data can be much more reliable.
Thank you. And last but not least, Rian.
Sure. And so for me, I guess my take-home message is just that it's, aside from just fraud and the incorrect practices that contribute to data reproducibility and integrity, just make sure that from the very beginning you're answering the clinical question that you want to ultimately use your data for correctly, because that's where I think data reproducibility really runs into problems, is you started out trying to answer one question, and eventually you're trying to get to a new patient population with your clinical data, and it just can't be reproduced there. So just start from the very beginning doing your due diligence and make sure that you have your plan in order.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for sharing expertise. This has been really informative. We hope that you enjoyed the audience interaction as well. I'd like to again take a moment to thank our sponsors, MVM Associates, Cesare Rives, and UP University Place Associates. So thank you to our sponsors again, and again to our experts. We know you have lots of work to do, and we appreciate you sharing your time with our audience today. Thank you, and have a good week.
Thank you.